And Tony Clement, he's a former Minister of Industry, and I was talking, Tony, about how under the Harper government there was always that push for the big fourth player. So as you take a look at this deal right now, what do regulators have to weigh?
Well, I think you're quite right. I was industry minister when we brought in more competition, Win Mobile, public mobile place competition like that. In this case, I think you're going to have different regulators looking at different things. You've got the CRTC and the Competition Bureau going to be looking at competition and choice arguments. And I think generally the government is also going to be looking at those cell phone bills and the pricing for consumers. So there's a lot to weigh on this. Of course, on the other side of the ledger is the 5G networks and the promise that the 5G network will be more of a reality at an affordable cost to the consumer with this kind of merger.
Yeah, how much weight do you think, Ed, from your role as a former industry minister, would that assuage you back in the day? Because obviously you start putting out the sweeteners right away, right? They were very quick to say, hey, listen, you put the two of us together, we're going to spend billions on 5G, we're going to bring it to areas that perhaps thought they're going to be underserved, we're going to make sure there's internet in rural areas for Indigenous communities. I mean, they've already thrown those sweeteners out there. Is that something that would have swayed you back in the day?
Well, I think that would be something that you have to look at, but maybe I'm jaded after all these years, but a lot of people promised a lot of things over the years, and somehow it didn't come to complete fruition. So I think that they're going to look at that, but they have some choices. They don't have to flat out say this merger will not happen. They can say things like, we will allow this merger, but we are adding these conditions. And that's the kind of thing that I did as industry minister under the Investment Canada Act, which obviously does not apply here, but the same kind of logic may well apply. Yeah, over at the Rogers side, CEO Joe Natale pretty much admitting that today, saying, listen, I think when it comes to the cable business, it's pretty complementary. There's not a lot of overlap, but he does recognize. He wouldn't say what he thinks regulators might ask them to do, but he did recognize that there's going to be a discussion on the wireless front. So again, from your past experience, as you ask for divestitures and deals like this, what do you think in terms of the footprint for both of these companies might be some logical divestitures to get this deal through? Well, I think you're quite right, and Joe Natale is quite adept at identifying things that the regulators want to hear. What you want to try to do as a regulator or as a government is preserve as much competition as possible, because that ultimately depresses the pricing. It's very clear. When I allowed for public mobile and Win Mobile and these new entrants, miraculously, I say with a straight face, prices went down, competition went up. So you want to try to preserve as much of that market signaling as possible. When it comes to these new entrants and the fourth players and the smaller players, I mean, part of the policy to get them a foot in the door was to reserve a certain amount of spectrum for them. We have a spectrum auction coming up in a couple of months. Some analysts have pointed out, well, this is very weird timing, right? The fact that you would have had Shaw getting a crack at some of the spectrum, and they're not so sure now, because if you got this deal in the works, you would simply really just be giving that spectrum to Rogers. Yeah, and this has been a constant problem, I got to say, because we did reserve spectrum back in 2010 and 2011, and it may go to new entrants, but those new entrants may be gobbled up by the established telcos. So it's not just about spectrum; it's also the way you're allowed to compete. And there was all these anti-competitive behaviors where the incumbents would say, "Oh no, we're competing against Win Mobile," but whenever a Win Mobile call went into their area where Win Mobile didn't have towers, all of a sudden the calls would be dropped and you'd be left with a dial tone. So little things like that can go a long way to depress competition for the incumbents. So you've got to, as a regulator and as a government, you've got to look at a lot of contingencies to make sure that competition actually takes place.
What do you think it is about Canada that seemingly the ecosystem, now is it the ecosystem, is it the market, is it the demand for these services, or is it the regulations that in the end you end up with about 3 players, maybe a 4th smaller one as you go from region to region to region, it differs, but in the end you get sort of roughly the same amount, even though that big push from your government and the Trudeau government talking about trying to bring down prices, increase competition, it never seems to take hold. What's going on in this country?
I think a couple of things. First of all, it's very capital intensive to be a new entrant. You've got to put a lot of dough out there to build your towers and to build your infrastructure. And frankly, the second thing has been no international competition, right? So all of a sudden, you've got a domestic market where there's no pressure on price, no pressure on service when it comes to the international telcos. Now, there's an obvious downside. Always the worry was you let the international telcos in, you won't have any domestic telcos. But clearly, with having domestic telcos without that fear of competition has had an impact on the marketplace as well.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you, do you think the time has come to open up Canada's telecom industry to foreign companies?
Well, I didn't think it was the time 12 years ago. I thought we could create a new marketplace with new entrants. That didn't work out so well. So is there a way that you can have international competition without all of the domestic telcos being gobbled up by the big American giants or some of the big European giants? That's an open question. But I tell you, there's always, as a former politician, there's always pressure from consumers who want affordable cell phone charges, and in Canada, we don't stack up very well on that front.
All right, interesting to get your insights on a day like this. Thanks for joining us.
For sure.
Tony Clement, of course, a former politician in the Harper government, a former Minister of Industry.